Welcome to The Inquiring Cat Does Politics. As Plato once said, one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And this week's episode of The Inquiring Cat Does Politics is really a stream of interconnected thought, because we've had a lot of interesting events go on. Yesterday, Yoon Suk Yeol from South Korea was arrested at last. And I was thinking that this is a sign of an immature democracy when you end up having somebody holed up in the presidential palace, unable to be arrested because his supporters, but also his bodyguards, stopped the first attempt. And it took 1,000 police officers yesterday to go into the compound and to successfully arrest him. But that's a little bit unfair to immature democracies, because you have to think, except President Trump and the storming of the Capitol in America, you would never have imagined that would happen in a mature democracy. And then similarly, you think that a few years ago in Spain, there was the big political scandal in the right-wing party where wads of euros were being handed out in brown envelopes to various people in a corruption scandal, another sign of an immature democracy. Except you have to think about what happened with PPP and COVID equipment here in the UK just a few years ago. So we live in strange times. Take Justin Trudeau in Canada. So Justin Trudeau, the press have given him a hard time, considering he was actually re-elected. He didn't get thrown out at the end of his first term. But what has brought him low is a very interesting article on Radio 4 the other day about Canada. And the Canadians welcome immigration. There's a very open-hearted attitude towards immigration in Canada, and they know they need it to build their economy. But it is the lack of support for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants generally, and the enormous pressure it has put on housing, this sounds familiar, that has been part of his undoing. And the press, and eventually even people in his own party, turned against him. The press, of course, is enormously powerful in determining the future of our politicians. And it's quite right that we have a lovely free press here in the UK that holds people to account. That has been certainly the experience of Tulip Siddiqui this week. And I've asked myself, has she been pursued because of misogyny? Or has she been pursued just because the mainstream media is always going to be like a dog with a bone after whichever government is in power? But there's an old saying that you shouldn't visit the sins of the fathers on their children. And the fact that she has this aunt who was head of Bangladesh and fled to India on the back of an alleged corruption scandal, 150 odd billion dollars has disappeared apparently from the Bangladesh economy. And allegedly lots of students were shot during the demonstrations towards the end of her rule. That's not the fault of Tulip Siddiqui, but you should call into question her political judgment. We might not like or love all our relatives, and it seems to me somewhat implausible that she would have been completely oblivious to what was going on back in Bangladesh under her aunt's rule. And certainly with her political ambitions here in the UK, you might imagine that she would have realized it was wise to distance herself if she wanted to build her career here. But what really, I think, has been her undoing is that apparently she asserted that she had never talked politics with her aunt. And then, of course, the press, doing a great job, dug out the fact that she had campaigned for her aunt. And indeed, when the aunt's offices were ransacked, there were leaflets from Tulip Siddiqui in her aunt's office. So politics had obviously been discussed, and be sure that eventually your lies will find you out. So that was the end of Tulip Siddiqui. And I don't think it was anything to do with misogyny. Now, Sir Keir Starmer, therefore, has had a slightly rough week because of that, but he's had a really good week when there were announcements made about the NHS, because we all want the NHS to be more efficient. And I've never quite understood why it's necessary for a GP to refer you to a consultant before you can have a scan, when very often the GP will be able to make that judgment themselves. And that should help cut waiting lists significantly. And similarly, the tradition of always having a follow-up appointment with your consultant after an operation, if they've just done something like a ingrowing toenail, why do you need to have a follow-up appointment for that? It's a nonsense. So I thought those were good announcements. And Wes Streeting, I think he's probably the one I like most out of the Labour cabinet, although interestingly enough, one of my friends on the left says that they think he's lightweight and not up to the job. One thing I would agree with is that he's certainly not a big beast in the political world as we might have thought about it in the past. So he also talked about using the waiting lists reduction to use the private sector to reduce the waiting lists in the NHS. And that, of course, is eminently sensible. The joke is that as a Labour minister, Wes Streeting can say that, Keir Starmer can announce it, and there's not a peep from the unions or the nurses union and the NHS and so on. Had a Conservative politician made such an announcement, I predict there would have been enormous uproar. So some good news on the NHS. Let's keep our fingers crossed it's going to improve things. But there are some other things that were not talked about. And this is the accept factor on that good news. Absenteeism in the NHS is appalling. And I have got very good anecdotal evidence from people I know who work in the sector about people, whether they're healthcare assistants or nurses, who go off on repeated long periods of sickness, often only returning to work for a day. And although there are sickness management protocols in place, they very much do not seem to be highly efficient. I've also heard stories of people in the NHS wanting to get more pillows on their ward, and they go over to the neighbouring ward across the corridor at one of the big London teaching hospitals, only to be told, oh no, you can't have a pillow from here because we pay 4 times as much for our pillows as you pay for them in the ward the other side of the corridor. Procurement in the NHS is a mess and it needs sorting out on a national scale. And when I worked in the hospitality industry, I saw some great initiatives as to how you use a vast global organization, manpower, to drive down purchasing costs by incentivizing frontline managers to find sources of materials and equipment that you need. And we should do the same thing in the NHS. Now, the other thing is sterile stock. So I was talking to somebody recently who supplies the NHS with sterile equipment. And when it's delivered, the consultants order what they want, probably not obeying the procurement rules because they are consultants, so they're God Almighty and they can do what they like. And the sterile stock gets put away in cupboards and it sits there and it isn't always used. And then when the sterile date has expired, the equipment gets thrown in the trash can rather than being refurbished and re-sterilized. The amount of wastage that this supplier benefits from in terms of new orders that they don't really need to have must be very significant. So there's a lot of waste in the NHS that needs dealing with, and I didn't see anything about that in the announcements this week. And of course, the other great thing that Starmer announced this week was around AI. He's quite right. It's going to change the world we live in, except another exception. He spoke about the fact that it will create 15,000 jobs. Whoopee! And most of those will be in the building trade in the short to medium term to build the data centers required. Whoopee! However, we're also trying to build 1.5 million homes, of course, in 3 years. Where does he think these builders are going to come from? He's going to cut immigration, no builders coming in. We already know the 1.5 million housing target will never be met for a whole variety of reasons, such as insufficient building materials, insufficient timber, insufficient skilled workers. Angela Rayner says she's going to train people to be builders. Does she know how long that takes? The whole thing's a nonsense. So all these great announcements just don't thread together in the reality of anything being actually delivered. And they're setting themselves up for failure. And I think it would be far better to talk about what can be achieved rather than dreams beyond what is humanly possible, unless there's some amazing influx of people allowed into the country to do the building. And as Trevor Phillipson pointed out the other day on his Sunday programme, some of the houses are going to be needed not for our population today, but for the builders who will come in to do the work because they've got to live somewhere as well. It's a convoluted mess that the government has got itself into, I think, on this one. And that AI conference, of course, apart from the nonsense that we're going to have all these people available to build, was hijacked by the Rachel Reeves stuff. Now, one of my interlocutors said to me the other day that they thought that a lot of misogyny was around the criticism in the press and by others of Rachel Reeves because she was suffering more from analysis and criticism than people like Jeremy Hunt had been subject to. I don't think it's anything to do with misogyny. I think it's to do with the fact that she lied on her CV and that she has produced a budget which is anti-growth rather than pro-growth, which is what we were promised before the election. So the AI conference had some interesting elements in it, but a lot of it was fantasy and a lot of it ain't going to be delivered. So where does Rachel Reeves go from here? Ooh, big question. So Rachel Reeves has promised no more taxes. Well, she's not quite promised that. She's just implied that there'll be no more taxes along the lines of the ones she's already inflicted upon us. My prediction is that she will produce another tax, and it's going to be probably an exit tax like they have in some countries like America, so that any of the millionaires and billionaires that are threatening to leave the country will not be able to take all their money with them without paying a significant exit tax. So I think that's what's going to be coming in the not too distant future, because her headroom of £10 billion has gone through her own stupidity and decisions. It really beggars belief. Anyway, there we are. Quick roundup of the lunacy of the world of politics for this week. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week. Have a great weekend. Spring is soon upon us, weather-wise, if not politically. Cheerio for now.